I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Glad to be here. Glad to have you along as well. Today's program is going to be a great one. I've got an author, a person that I met recently and hope to engage over the future on an important topic. He's author, Dr. Professor Christopher P. Lehman, I believe that's right, and he is author of a book called Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State. Here's a copy of it if you're watching this on YouTube or Twitter or on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. So, Dr. Lehman, is that right, Dr. Lehman or Professor Lehman? What's better?
Yes, that's right.
Great. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your energy and your work and your curiosity. Thank you for joining us for the program today. The book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State. What's the premise of the book? Why did you start it? And what were you seeking to discover? And let's talk about in the next hour what you did discover and what takeaway you and for me and for people around the state, around the world who are interested in knowing how many ways this institution called slavery has shaped our culture, our future, our history, and still impacts our lives in ways we may not imagine. So first of all, the book, Slavery's Reach, what's the idea behind creating this research and telling this story?
Well, I came up with the idea shortly after I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations, a little over 5 years ago. And at the time, I had been looking at Minnesota's history with African Americans in the context of when Southern African Americans were brought to Minnesota. And with Coates' article, I started to think more in terms of a concrete paper trail that has to do with the transfer of wealth. And I found the best paper trail was through real estate deeds. And I came across this when I came across someone from St. Paul who was documented in the 1860 census as living in St. Paul, but was documented that same year in the slave schedule as living in Maryland, or at least holding a slave in Maryland. And I'd never come across a person who lived in Minnesota while being registered as a Southern slaveholder at the same time. And it turns out that that person from St. Paul, Harwood Eichelhart, dealt in real estate. And that led me to wonder how many other people from the South came to Minnesota just for the real estate. And I started looking at real estate deeds from counties all over Minnesota, or at least the counties that bordered the Mississippi River, since that's the most likely way that Southerners would travel. And what I found was that there were quite a few Southerners who came to Minnesota and invested their money, which was capital from slave plantations, into these real estate lots and blocks, and in businesses, and ultimately in institutions. And when Minnesotans received this money, then they developed their communities and they developed their businesses from this slave capital. So the book is my 4 years or so of research about which slaveholders came to Minnesota and put their money here, and which Minnesotans used that money to develop the territory and the state of Minnesota.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. My guest on the phone is Professor Christopher P. Lehman. He's a professor of ethnic studies at St. Cloud State University. He's author of Slavery in the Upper Mississippi Valley from 1787 to 1865, A History of Human Bondage in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And we're here talking about his newest book, printed by Minnesota Historical Society Press. The book is Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State. And just looking at the cover notes on the back, one of our friends and people that's well known here, a person that's well known in Twin Cities, William D. Green, writes, the title of Professor Lehman's book, Slavery's Reach, aptly describes the many ways that slavery touched the free soil of Minnesota during the territorial period and the earliest years of statehood. Notably, it didn't happen by conquest of marauding bushwhackers seeking to kill freedom-loving settlers from the east, but by civic and business leaders in cash-starved Minnesota who welcomed slave-generated Southern dollars to promote commerce and trade, invest in banks, and establish state institutions. This is an important addition to the canon of racial history of Minnesota. And so Dr. Green is the author of a book called A Peculiar Imbalance, The Fall and Rise of Racial Equality in Early Minnesota, former professor at Augsburg College and former superintendent of Minneapolis Public Schools. Professor Lehman, what is the connection? You started off with mentioning the name Iglehart, and obviously what comes to mind is Iglehart Street in St. Paul. And as I have skimmed the book, I got a copy yesterday, I haven't read it yet, I'm reading it, but what pops up are names that I'm familiar with, but I don't have the context that you're beginning to provide me with in reading this book. So, were you curious about and were you surprised about the connections that you discovered in writing and researching this book?
Yes, I was very surprised, especially as someone who's not from Minnesota, but originally from Oklahoma. I had been educated and raised to believe that Minnesota was largely untouched by slavery, and so I wasn't expecting to find the connections that I did. So I was very surprised to come across names like Henry Sibley and Henry Rice, and to find that they have financial connections to slavery. They were not slaveholders themselves, but as the first chapter points out, they were definitely employed by slaveholders because the fur trade in Minnesota was dominated by the American Fur Company, and the American Fur Company was owned by 3 slaveholding partners from St. Louis, Missouri. So whenever anyone from Minnesota was employed by American Fur, they were ultimately paid by these slaveholders. And Henry Sibley and Henry Rice are just 2 of those people. And Sibley was, in fact, working for the slaveholders even while he was the first governor of the Free State of Minnesota. And another employee, John Prince, was the founder of the city of Princeton, Minnesota. Amazing.
And I'm flipping through the book as you're speaking and seeing the picture of Governor Sibley and one of Dr. Charles William Borup, Wolf Borup. What's his story?
Borup is another employee of American Fur, and so because of his employment, he also has ties to slavery in Minnesota. And in addition to Borup and Sibley and Rice, there's also Sylvanus Lowry, who I know about a lot just from living here in St. Cloud. And there's a chapter just on Lowry and
let's talk about
all
him.
of his investments.
Yeah, let's talk about Lowry.
Okay. Well, Sylvanus Lowry was born in the 1820s in Kentucky, and his father was a minister for the Cumberland Presbyterians. And President Jackson appointed Lowry's father to be a missionary for the Ho-Chunk Nation. And they lived in Wisconsin at the time, so the whole Lowry family had to go to Wisconsin to minister to this indigenous nation. And as the federal government pushed them further westward, the Lowry family went west too. And then at some point, Lowry's father retired and decided to move back to the south in Tennessee. But by then, it was the late 1840s, Lowry was an adult, and he was working for American Fur. And he'd become quite wealthy from it. So with that money from working for the fur trade, he bought the northern third of what eventually became the city of St. Cloud. And it's the area directly to the south of the St. Cloud Hospital. And it actually includes the St. Cloud Hospital land as well. And when he bought that land in 1855 or so, he asked his father's friends from Tennessee to come to Minnesota and come to St. Cloud specifically and buy that land. And they did. And they were slaveholders. And from those slaveholders, I think that Lowry received $12,000 in sales in the summer of 1856 alone. And that is $250,000 in today's money. And from that money, Lowry was able to start St. Cloud's business community. He built these warehouses and allowed local business people to rent them and to have their businesses there. And Lowry himself had an express company and a ferry business across the Mississippi River. And he was also the person who started the newspaper that we call the St. Cloud Times today. So St. Cloud's business community definitely would not have existed as it is today without the seed money that Lowry had from slave capital.
And so that story sort of repeats itself again and again in Twin Cities and throughout Minnesota. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Because of all the coverage that the American fur people had with Sibley and Rice and John Prince, Norman Kitson as well. I mean, those fur trading posts were all over the state, and wherever you had a fur trading post, you had someone who was an employee of slaveholders. So it's very widespread, but it's especially concentrated by the Mississippi River because that's where Southerners would come in the spring and summer months. And so that's where the tourism businesses were. And tourism was very important to Minnesota in those days. And they really catered to Southerners. They really wanted to have Southern dollars in those spring and summer months.
You have a chapter called Elite Planters. What's the direction of that inquiry?
That is about the wealthiest of the slaveholders that I found who invested in Minnesota. They were people who could afford to come to Minnesota just for the spring and summer months and stay for the entire season, and then ultimately go back to the South when it was really cold. And perhaps the biggest investor of these was a man by the name of Thomas Winston. And he definitely was what we would call a snowbird. He lived in Minnesota in the spring and summer, and he lived in Louisiana in the fall and the winter. And he invested quite heavily in counties across the state. And there were other people who might have been wealthy in the South and just decided to sell the bulk of their wealth, which would have been their slaves, and then move to Minnesota full time. And that's in the chapter about migrants. But there were some people who would just sell all the slaves right before moving to Minnesota. So even if they didn't have slaves in the state,
the capital,
the money that they used for the land definitely came from those sales.
Curious, are there people that are native Minnesotans that ended up attracted to and going into the slave business? Is the reverse also true, that there are quote-unquote Minnesotans who were able to discover fortune or opportunity by going into the slaveholding states and directly involved in the trade or any element or aspect of it? I'm just raising the question, if you found that at all.
Certainly. Well, what I have found with people that we would consider to be Minnesotans or prominent Minnesotans was that once they discovered that slave capital contributed a lot to Minnesota, they didn't want to let that go. And perhaps Henry Rice is the best example of that, because when Rice became a congressman and he went to Washington, D.C., he met with quite a few Southern slaveholders who are now his colleagues in Congress. and he invited them to invest in land in Minnesota. And one of them invested in one of Minnesota's institutions, a man named William Aiken from South Carolina, who held 700 to 800 people as slaves in South Carolina, came to Minnesota in the summer of 1850. At that time, the University of Minnesota had been shut down for 2 years after having been open for 3. And when Aiken saw that the U of M was shuttered, he decided to loan the university $15,000 on the spot, which again is $250,000 today. And with that money, the U of M was able to...
Which was slave money, slave capital, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it was all from slavery because of all those hundreds of people he held and put to work. And with that money, the U of M was able to complete construction of a building enough for the university to reopen in early 1858. And by then, Aiken had cashed out half of his money, which still left $7,000 in the U of M coffers. And then when the Civil War happened, the state decided to try to find a way to keep the money that they owed to Aiken. And they passed a law the following year, 1862. It was called the Rebellion Act. And under the Rebellion Act, no one living in a Confederate state could come to Minnesota and sue in its courts. So that meant that Aiken could not go to Minnesota and get his money back. And he never did.
So how did that act reflect general public sentiment about slavery and about the conflict of the war between the states? What did it say about the general disposition of white Minnesotans or Minnesotans of means at the time, and how our residents of our state viewed the conflict and the tangible and intangible impact of the slavery system?
Well, from what I've researched, nobody, not even Southerners, wanted to come to Minnesota and start a plantation economy because it's not feasible. The climate gets too cold and the soil won't cooperate. But they wanted to leave room for capital from slavery to be perfectly fine among Minnesotans. And that worked for a while. There were people who may not have wanted slavery, may not have even liked slavery, but they still took money from Southerners who wanted to stay at their hotels or who wanted to buy their land. And I think that the rationale among Minnesotans was, well, we're not buying anybody, we're not whipping anybody, we're not selling anybody, so our hands are clean. We're just taking money from the people who are doing those things, but we're not actually doing them ourselves. And that's how people rationalized the taking of the capital in Minnesota from these slaveholders. And it became so important that it affected Minnesota politically. Because when Minnesota began, it began under Democratic presidents. And back then, to be a Democrat meant that you were in favor of slavery, not only in the states where it was, but expanded to territories as well. If you were a Republican, then you didn't want slavery to expand.
The party of Lincoln.
Exactly, right. So, in 1860, we had elected a governor who was Republican in Minnesota. And that made a lot of Minnesotans scared that Southerners would not want to come to Minnesota if a Republican was the governor, since Republicans were known for wanting to limit slavery. So there were two people who were Democrats in the Minnesota legislature who drafted proposals for slavery to be legal after Minnesota had already become a state. They wanted slavery to be legal just in the tourism season and just for the tourists. Unfortunately, both of those bills failed, but they did not fail unanimously. And among the people who voted for the bill were Democrats who had made a killing from the tourism dollars. They didn't want those dollars to go away. So they were willing to compromise their own state's policy of being a free state just to keep that money flow going.
That's amazing. I'm looking at a photograph now of someone named Jerry Steele, Jeremiah Jerry Steele. And this goes to the question of how people who were slaveholders, owners of enslaved people, navigated, some of which included bringing their slaves with them that you just talked about. What's the story on Jeremiah Jerry Sears?
Well, I don't know exactly why R.J. Mendenhall brought him. I know that he did, and I know that Jerry had been officially a free person because his mother was free. But for whatever reason, once Jerry was brought to Minnesota, he was treated as if he were enslaved. And I came across the census of 1860, which had said that Jerry was not receiving an education, even though he was of the age of someone going to school. And the census did not record him with a last name, even though as a free person he would have been entitled to have a last name as well as a first name. So I'm not sure if Mendenhall brought him just to be a servant of the house. That's my guess, because Mendenhall took him completely away from his family, which had still lived in North Carolina at the time. But whenever Southerners came with their slaves, at least those who were here just for the vacations would take maybe one or two with them and then leave the dozens or hundreds, however many they had, behind in the South. So what that meant was a slave in Minnesota would be totally isolated from his or her family, and there would not be that many African Americans in Minnesota, especially in terms of free communities of African Americans who could help them transition to freedom if they wanted to take advantage of Minnesota being a free state. So whenever the vacation ended, the slaves would always go back to the South. And for Minnesotans who were in favor of the slave dollars, that's how they would rationalize keeping it going. They would say, well, these slaves are going back voluntarily, even though they could stay and be free, so that's on them.
And they volunteered to return to slavery. Laughable.
It was just awful the way that Minnesotans tried to dance around the legality of it by putting it on the slaves themselves.
Well, it's not undifferent from blaming black people for low performance in public education, and the state sort of washing its hands or saying it's doing all it can and blaming whatever number of problems there are in black families or with black children as the source and the reason for consistent and pervasive underperformance in the black community, and not taking responsibility for the fact that it has a stellar reputation in educating the general public, but has the worst reputation in the country when it comes to the engagement and the success of educating black and brown children. So a lot of this hasn't changed in terms of the experience or the story. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. I'm talking with Professor Dr. Christopher P. Lehman. He's the author of a new book. It's called Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State, published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press, and a fascinating read. I'm reading it now. I got a copy yesterday, but just in flipping through, what is striking me over the head is all of the names that I'm familiar with that I haven't had a chance to put in context. And this book, as I read it, and when I read it carefully, I'll be sort of noting all of these iconic names tied to iconic places or institutions or attitudes or movements in Minnesota's present and past experience in history, because I think that what is created is a narrative of acceptance of all that these names symbolize and all of the fortunes they represent. But what's not apparent is the consequence in terms of human life, in terms of morality, the morality of the bondage of human beings, and the decision of who would be presented as decent, aggressive, or prosperity-minded, freedom-loving Minnesotans and Americans, the double-sidedness of their experience, because that experience is underpinned by the subjugation of people who are black Africans who were enslaved. And so, I was going to ask you, who are the Mendenhalls? I know the name, but you might talk about them, because they are the family that is quoted in the story of Jerry Sears, who was brought here to live with one of the Mendenhalls. What is their family story?
Well, this is interesting because R.J.'s uncle, George Mendenhall, as well as R.J.'s father, they were both Quakers. Mm-hmm. And even though George Mendenhall was a Quaker, and the Quakers were anti-slavery, he had married a woman who was not a Quaker and who had belonged to a very wealthy slaveholding family. Hmm. And she had inherited slaves from her parents. And then she died, and George, the Quaker, all of a sudden became this slaveholder of dozens of slaves. Now, what he would try to do was to take a few slaves at a time to the west and purchase some land for them to settle and let them be emancipated there and start their new lives as free people out west. He didn't go as far west as Minnesota to buy land for the free people. George did buy land in Minnesota, but it wasn't specifically for any of the people that he wanted to free. But because he bought land in Minnesota, that's why George is mentioned in the book. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I had included a story in the book about how when one or two of George's slaves had run away, George had his nephew R.J. and someone else chase after the slave all over the country before eventually coming back to North Carolina empty-handed because they never found the runaway. And so R.J., having had that experience, comes to Minnesota, and he doesn't own any slaves. He doesn't inherit any from his father or his uncle, but he uses his childhood of being exposed to slavery to amass his fortune in Minnesota. And he and his partner, his business partner, decide to have a real estate company, and they seek finances from Southerners that they know who are slaveholders. And all these Southerners invest in the company. Southerners are invited to Minnesota to buy land that he and his partner have. And with that wealth, RJ gets tapped to be in charge of a very prominent bank in Minnesota as well. And that's how he derived his fortune in Minnesota.
Which bank was that?
Oh, let me see if I can find the name of that bank.
And while you're looking, think about this. I'll take a break in a few minutes to do some station business. But during that break, if you would, Dr. Lehman, maybe you could look at or flip through, bring to mind a passage or two that you'd like to read. I think hearing the actual story read by you would be valuable. I can tell you that this conversation is valuable to me personally, so I appreciate the research that you have done and the discoveries that you are now sharing. I think that it's important for all of us to examine this question of accountability, of connection to the atrocity of the slave trade. And I say that because I've had several meetings with white people that I know. One with a former county commissioner, for example, and when I was the board chair of the Minneapolis Urban League, the executive director and I met with the chairman of the Hennepin County Commission, and sort of out of nowhere, he said, North Minneapolis has a lot of problems, and the county's put a lot of money there. Not sure that we should be investing so heavily because this is like a black hole, so to speak. And then he said, and you guys are always talking about slavery and all the problems that your people are experiencing. I had nothing to do with it. It's not my problem, and I don't want to be challenged about any of the consequences of slavery. My people weren't involved in it. And so I think that that's a fairly commonly held attitude. People that are direct, and you're discovering and showing the direct connection and benefit that Minnesotans experience because of investments from slaveholders and slaveholding states. But people who were direct beneficiaries of this cruel and inhumane system want to disavow that involvement, to cloud it, to hide it, to obscure it, so that that discussion doesn't take place. And it gives them the mental and social freedom to simply say, black people are failing because they're black, not because of the structural relationships and the consequences of the institution of slavery that we created to grow power and wealth and what we say is a great nation in the world. And so I want to talk about that, but if you would look for a passage or two that you'd like to read that you think sort of capture some of the findings that your research has resulted in. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. My guest on the phone is Dr. Christopher P. Lehman. He's with the professor of ethnic studies at St. Cloud State University, also author of Slavery in the Upper Mississippi Valley, 1787 to 1865, A History of Human Bondage in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. His new book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State. And I'm promising you that this is a wonderful read. Like I said, I got it yesterday. I'm looking through it right now, sort of catching titles and chapter titles, etc., photographs, but I'm excited to be able to read it, especially having this conversation with Christopher P. Lehman, the author. I'll take a break for station business, and we'll come back in just a second. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane.
Tune in to the Wave Project on January 26th, 10 a.m. for the 7th JQ Sound session with a little dance music. Spanning sock hops to 60s dances to rock and roll, nightclubbing to punk to disco to techno, the JQ Sound will once again bring to you fascinating, interesting, and curious songs. Be seeing you.
Programming is supported by the Science Museum of Minnesota, presenting Latinx Americans in Science, a museum science fusion event celebrating diversity in our community. On January 25th from noon to 4 p.m., guests can discover the possibilities of a career in science through hands-on experiments and activities. Attendees can meet inventors, engineers, and educators from the Twin Cities. More information at smm.org.
KFAI and the Cedar Cultural Center present Drone, Not Drones, the 7th annual 28-hour drone. For the 7th year in a row, more than 50 musicians from across the musical spectrum will unite to create a continuous, uninterrupted, 28-hour drone of unified sounds to raise money for Doctors Without Borders. The entire event will be simulcast on KFAI starting at 7 p.m. on Friday, January 31st. More information and tickets available at cedar.org.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. My guest on the phone is Dr. Christopher P. Lehman. He's the author of the new book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State. And we're just talking about what he discovered in his research that ends up in this book. I am reading it now, starting to read it, and I'm excited about it, excited to have this conversation with you. So, Doctor, did you get a chance to sort of pick out something you'd like to talk about or read in terms of a passage from the book?
Yes, and before I start the passage, to answer the question from before the break, R.J. Mendenhall became the head of the State Bank of Minnesota, and he was the head for a few decades. Right, but the passage that I have here is from the introduction to the book. From the establishment of Minnesota as a territory in 1849 to the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, slaveholders invested in land and businesses in Minnesota. Many of them traveled from their southern homes to make the transactions in person, but others arranged for Minnesotans with power of attorney to facilitate the purchases. The investors' practices spanned the gamut of human possession, represented by yeomen who owned a single enslaved person, elite planters who kept hundreds of people captive, reluctant heirs who manumitted slaves whenever possible, and enthusiastic masters who acquired as many people as possible. It is not surprising that Southerners who were prosperous enough to invest or vacation in Minnesota relied on slaveholding wealth. This is not, however, the point. The recruiting of investors by Minnesota's political leaders, the eagerness of new communities to attract those investments, the participation of financial institutions, the catering to rich tourists, all were part of the web of connections tying northern development to southern slavery. Indeed, wealth pouring into Minnesota from the northeastern United States was also made in banking and industries that grew because of the labor of enslaved people. Minnesotans and other northerners have forgotten their state's complicity in the slaveholding economy, just as some Southerners have denied that the Civil War was fought over slavery. A reader might question the relative level of slaveholder investment in Minnesota land and businesses. Did it comprise 1% or 10% or 40% of all investment in the state? While it's not possible to calculate this figure, it is abundantly clear that people in Minnesota invited, encouraged, and welcomed any investments and expenditures from slaveholders, and broke their own laws in order to facilitate such income. Investments made by slaveholders were crucial to Minnesota's development at times and in specific areas of the state. This book does not argue that slaveholder wealth was the defining element in the growth of the new territory. Instead, it uncovers the ties and demonstrates how Minnesotans allowed illegal slaveholding in their communities and benefited from it. Minnesota was not a distant land, far from the turmoil of 1850s U.S. politics. It was the front lines of the pre-war battle over slavery. In tracing the people, financial institutions, and political entities that brought slaves and slaveholding wealth into the territory and state, this book demonstrates slavery's reach.
Oh, that's an amazing piece. That's wonderful. I'm reading along with you here. A passage from his book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State. Dr. Christopher P. Lehman is on the phone. Now, this conversation, not only is it live on KFAI, but we're streaming it live to Facebook, to Twitter, and to YouTube. And if you're joining this conversation on any of those platforms, we want you to like it and to share it and to sort of watch us as we continue to use these technologies to broaden our reach and to bring you content that we think is robust, rich, informative, and that we are happy to serve and present and project through these platforms. Also, if you have suggestions or questions for the guest, maybe hit me up on Twitter or on Facebook. I think I can monitor comments from those who are listening and watching on Facebook, and I'll try to share your question or your comment to our guest, Dr. Christopher P. Lehman. And maybe you've chosen another passage to read as well. But before we do that, Dr. Lehman, let's go to your own personal story. You said you were from Oklahoma. Tell me about you as a growing up and who your family, who was your family? Where have you come from?
Well, I am originally from Oklahoma. I was born in Philadelphia while my father was attending graduate school at Lehigh University. And when he graduated, I was 2 years old, and he had a teaching job waiting for him at the University of Central Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. And at the age of 2, my sister and I and my parents moved there. And so that's where I was raised. But my father's side of the family is largely from Louisiana, and my mother's side of the family is from South Carolina, also Georgia and Florida. Mm-hmm. And I had grown up listening to and hearing about stories about my father's side of the family, but I didn't hear that much about my mother's side. And I had always had the impression that my mother's side of the family was fairly small because I had 2 cousins, and I had an aunt and an uncle and grandparents, and that's all I knew about my mother's side of the family. But through research, I was able to learn about how my grandparents had met in Tennessee after my grandfather had moved from Florida and my grandmother had moved from Georgia. And both my grandmother and my grandfather have roots in South Carolina, and not necessarily all that far from each other. And in looking at my mother's roots, I learned ultimately that I am a blood relative of one of the most violent people that has ever been in Congress. There's a man named Preston Brooks, and he was the congressman that had felt insulted when Charles Sumner of New York talked about his family and spoke negatively about slavery. And Preston Brooks came from a part of South Carolina called Edgefield, which is known for duels. And Preston had already been wounded in a duel, which was why he used a cane. But on that day in Congress in 1856, Preston hobbled over to Sumner with his cane and proceeded to whack Sumner repeatedly with the cane, so hard that he broke it while attacking Sumner. So I am a first cousin 5 times removed of Preston Brooks.
Preston Brooks, the slave owner.
Yes.
And so your family then connects itself or ties itself to or has the documentation connecting you to that plantation owner and that slaveholding family, apparently.
Yes, absolutely. Preston's grandfather held my great-great-great-grandparents, William and Rachel, in slavery. And when that grandfather, Zachariah Brooks, died in 1848, he willed my third great-grandparents to his daughter, Beth Brooks, and Beth lived in Florida. So my third great-grandparents had to be put into a wagon, and they had to travel maybe a couple of weeks by wagon from South Carolina all the way to Florida. And they were separated from all sorts of family and community in South Carolina to start a new life as enslaved people in Florida. And so that's why my grandfather is from Florida. It was because my third great-grandparents were passed down in this will.
So at what point in this genealogy was there the relationship that made the slaveholder your blood relative?
Oh, okay. There's a man by the name of Thomas Linton Bird, and he was a teenager when he had some kind of sexual encounter with one of his mother's sharecroppers, a woman by the name of Harriet Hewitt. And their daughter, my great-grandmother, was born in 1872. And even though Harriet Hewitt had used her last name for another child of hers, a son, but from a different father, when Rachel was born, Harriet decided to give Rachel the last name Bird, the same as her father, the sharecropper. And Rachel is listed in the census as being M for what they referred to as mulatto back then.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
Harriet definitely wanted to let the census taker know that this child of hers came from the white side of the family, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So how much, you've obviously done a great deal of genealogy on your family. Is that something that you and your sisters and brothers have done together, or is that one of your interests as a historian? How did you come to that? And I'm curious as to how this feeds into your scholarship and how your scholarship also feeds into your personal examination of your own lineage and your genealogy, and how that genealogy is a window for examining American history and the transatlantic slave trade for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I learned from my father's side of the family about how to do a family tree and how to maintain it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was from learning from my father's side of the family that I learned how to look at my mother's side of the family as well. And I learned very early on.
What did your father teach? He was a professor of what?
So he's a professor of English.
Of English, okay.
And he specialized in African American literature and also in the works of Chaucer.
Mm-hmm.
And my uncle and my cousin are really good at looking at the family tree
mm-hmm.
on my father's side of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And it was from them that I learned about how if you're African American, you definitely have to start at the 1870 census, because that's
mm-hmm.
the first one where everybody's free and
mm-hmm.
is listed by a last name
mm-hmm.
and first name. And how if you know where a person lived 10 years earlier and you knew how old they were, then you could go to a slave schedule where the slaves are listed anonymously and find a matching age, gender, and color.
Mm-hmm.
And if you hit the jackpot and you know the name of a slaveholder who died before 1865, then you can go to the probate court records and see your ancestor listed by name in a will or in a probate inventory. And it's through the probate inventories that I've been able to find names of my ancestors and the price tags next to them. For example, William from South Carolina was sold for, I think, $1,000. He was valued at $850, and he was sold for $1,000 in South Carolina, according to the probate court documents. But looking at those documents in genealogy helped me a great deal when I was doing the research for the book, because when I found the names of Southerners in the real estate deeds, I'd write down the names of the Southerners, anyone who bought land before 1865, who was from the South. And then I would go home and I would look for their names in the census records and in the probate court documents. And whenever I found matches, then I knew that those deeds were these concrete paper trails of a definite transaction of wealth from an active slaveholder, again being before 1865,
mm-hmm.
and a Minnesotan.
Amazing, amazing. Were you able to, in your own family, discover the initial person who was brought into the slave system from Africa? And have you added DNA research to your genealogy strategy?
I took a DNA test almost 10 years ago, and I wasn't able to find a whole lot more than what I already knew just from looking at paper trails. Mm-hmm. But I consider the work that I have been doing for the family tree to give me a wonderful understanding of my family. I've been doing it for 20 years as a hobby, and I unfortunately am still looking for that concrete mm-hmm. evidence of an ancestor who survived the Middle Passage. Mm-hmm. I have a couple of people in mind who are really close candidates, but I just haven't been able to conclusively confirm that these people definitely are my blood.
And so, as you think about your personal genealogy, how does that inform the research you're doing? You mentioned a little bit about the connections between the South and Minnesota. And in the writing of these books, where does that personal inquiry play in your mind and motivate the examination that you've undertaken? Or is there a relationship?